At the risk of sounding defensive, I'll say most people criticize anarchism without knowing much about it, or even knowing its leading historical figures, such as Bakunin, Kropotkin, Goldman, etc. Outside of anarchist circles, rarely do people actually read any classic anarchist works or attribute anything positive to the movement historically. They want to regard it as nothing but abstract, dangerous, and foolish. They simply criticize it because they've heard bad things about it and find it too unstable. It's an interesting and flawed response. I could easily note that the status quo is unstable and use that to justify whatever determination I have. And if one wishes, they can instantly refuse to accept that argument, thus proving nothing either way. That's unless I elaborate more, which I intend to do. First, what is really the stated desire of anarchism? Usually, it's this simple actually. It calls for a voluntary, worker-owned, and community-based system of production, wherein authority is at most a system of instantly recallable delegates with no special powers or privileges beyond negotiating ability. I fail to see the source of consternation here. Personally, it sounds better than being under the boot of a capitalist state and mindlessly serving whatever commands come down the pike. Some will give anarchism a fair hearing, but will devolve into distracting word games. They'll say, for example, that there's a difference between anarchy and anarchism. To me, at least, that's an invented and totally arbitrary distinction created by non-anarchists. I've read plenty of anarchist works where they referred to anarchy and anarchism as the same thing, and it didn't confuse me. So don't fall into such traps. And no, it's not necessary to abandon the term anarchism either. That's another pitfall discussion. Because of anarchism's bad rap, many people just want to discuss the word itself as the problem. The reality is, even if the wicked A word is changed, many critics and powers that be will start condemning the ideas behind the new word, and the new word falls along with that. It is the unfair critics who are most at fault, not the mere utterance of some syllables. They do not like the content and character of pure liberty, and they dislike the idea. They don't believe it's possible. They believe we can only be free in a regimented, essentially unfree fashion. We're free to live and work for the disproportionate benefit of some ruling class, or free to object and possibly starve in a gutter, and particularly true under the absence of a welfare state. The problem is, most people only consider anarchism as a theory, transforming it into nothing but semantics. However, as political theories go, anarchism is perhaps the least theoretical of them all. It overwhelmingly relies on debunking systems of authority and replacing them directly with active participants. Maybe anarchism hasn't been implemented on a popular or a wide scale at any point recently, but it can be approximated in everyday situations, and it actually requires that in order to be successful. Other systems rely more on people having faith that somehow they will reach a more ideal point of human progress by voting in the right people or supporting the right regime. Anarchism recognizes that only the people can liberate themselves from a given crisis. They say this requires individual actions rather than a bunch of rhetoric or future passage of bills into law. So anarchism inherently sees authority as naive and undesirable at best. Hence the historical importance of propaganda against it. We are supposed to feel empowered by the status quo. It is empowering through dependence, however, which is not an easy sell. So anarchism is depicted as chaos and authority as stabilizing, despite systematic war, corruption, racism, etc. Still, conformity is comforting to those who aren't its greatest victims. Needing to say yes to virtually everything can feel comforting, because many, if not most, decisions are made by other people. Then, if something bad happens, we can pick a convenient scapegoat, rather than critique ourselves for relegating our responsibilities elsewhere. And there you have it, that's politics. The premise is simple: let's keep most people uninvolved, then call them too ignorant and lazy for not knowing exactly what's going on. Rinse and repeat. In contrast, I assume we actually could have, let's say, universal health care and even roads without politicians like Tony Blair or Hillary Clinton or Kim Jong-il. It's just a question of access to resources and knowledge. The simple reality is anarchism is not just a bunch of gibberish. It sounds good when you elaborate on the ideas, and it somehow manages to both be complex and simple simultaneously. Because of that, at least in my experience, many initial skeptics will hear specific components of anarchism and say, I agree. They may disagree with employing anarchism on an absolute basis, but that's to be expected. Some authority may be justified and necessary after all. However, no authority should stand unquestioned. In fact, most anarchists grudgingly accept some authority roles as legitimate, like the role of parents. However, there are reasonable limits to what a parent should be able to do. Even a relatively legitimate authority figure shouldn't have vast power, let alone all the garbage authorities littering the world of today, and of course throughout history. And some will always wonder about anarchism and crime. Sure, we may always need to deal with the Ted Bundys of the world. However, these are not merely issues for anarchism to resolve. They are issues for human beings in general to address, or not resolve. In any case, they do not legitimize any permanent, vastly powerful system of authority, as we know those are quite often corrupt and murderous themselves. That's why I say if we really want to stop liars, murderers, and thieves from endangering public safety, we should stop voting them into office first. Ultimately, such issues call for flexible approaches. They challenge us, and there is no 100% one-size-fits-all solution. Infoshop.org, an anarchist website, suggests that violent, antisocial people could be sent to islands and left alone, where they can still essentially be free, but out of society's hair. I would also emphasize self-defense training to prevent violent crime, as well as not relying on abusive and corrupt police units. My personal view is that if basic police training has any validity, it should be generalized throughout the population. After all, no reasonable person truly believes police are infallible, even if they don't consider themselves anti-police. Rather than grant a small group of people special powers, privileges, and rights, and punishing what are usually small offenses, there needs to be emphasis on prevention and protection, along with regard for society's and people's rights. Serious crimes like murder can still be investigated in a free society. If people fear police and they haven't ever done anything violent, there's something wrong. Theft should just be regarded as what it is, theft. Most people can survive it, even if it is unfortunate. There's just something odd about throwing people into a concrete cell at gunpoint for, let's say, taking a candy bar without permission. Sure, we might lament petty theft, but it's certainly no worse than petty imprisonment, where small-time criminals are usually lumped in with murderers and rapists and compelled to join racist prison gangs. Also, while governments and corporations may lie, cheat, steal, and even murder with near total impunity. I'll explain things another way. The issue is not whether anarchism can or cannot be debunked. Any rule is likely to have exceptions. Instead, it's a matter of not being able to debunk simple lessons from world history. Throughout human existence, systems of both formal and informal authority have preyed on their subjects with some of the worst cruelties imaginable. This is no coincidence. It is a pattern, and it's not very hard to understand it. If you give people, that means anyone, special powers, privileges, and rights, you shouldn't be surprised when they use them in an abusive way. Not everyone in such a position is particularly abusive, but the door is certainly opened. The answer has been summed up with this adage: prevention is preferable to cure. The best way to prevent abuse is to not institutionalize such behavior and to apply the general principle of non-coercion to the extent possible. The biggest collective hurdle here is simple: Governments, corporations, and other lousy systems dominate resources and decision making, converting us into less social structures, stratifying us, turning us against each other, basically. It is difficult, if not impossible, to live and work in such a system without feeding its ills. Then there's the matter of what's highly regarded in society, such as the military. Throughout history, successful militaries have been very destructive, yet we are told they inherently protect our freedom. The irony is that militaries tend to restrict freedom to a ridiculous degree, internally and externally, whether or not they're slaughtering people at a given moment. Also, despite how authority tends to be ridiculously hypocritical, and how people commonly know this, we are still expected to regard authority as inherently necessary. But look at the president and consider the oath he took to preserve the Constitution. Does the president really do that? Certainly not always. It's called a living document, but I just as soon call it a dead one sometimes. More to the core of the issue, it should be remembered that governments, and in fact any human organizations, are ultimately abstract, collectivist entities. We choose to give them power or not to. In other words, there's always a hint of superstition to our organizations. We tend to make them bigger than they ever are by imagining they absolutely exist and absolutely must. We concretize them. This is why the anarchist Bakunin loved Hegel's famous maxim, everything that exists is rational. When you look at a government, you are ultimately looking at something that does not exist. It is like a ghost or a phantom. Its true power lies in belief, or a fear of physical or verbal retaliation for not believing, inflicted by those who do. That is the true nature and danger of government. It penalizes non-obedience because it cannot tolerate independent thought. Every single thought must follow a regimented pattern, and every pattern must conform to some people having rule over the rest. That's just a bad way of doing things, as far as I'm concerned. Incredibly, a lot of people fall sharply in line, not understanding the potential dangers of doing so, to others and even to themselves. However, reality is still there to be observed, and authority still sucks.